It is one of the most familiar sounds in modern history. A single, unaccompanied voice, almost a proclamation. A long, long time ago. It is the beginning of a story, a confession, a campfire tale for an entire generation. For over 50 years, Don McLean's American Pie has been a fixture of our cultural landscape. It is sung in bars at closing time, strummed on acoustic guitars at backyard parties, and played on classic rock radio in an endless, comforting loop. Millions of people know every word. We sing about the levee, the jester, the king, and the girl who sang the blues. But what are we actually singing about? For all its familiarity, American Pie remains one of music's greatest and most enduring riddles. It is an 8.5-minute epic, a dense, allegorical poem masquerading as a folk rock sing-along. It is a puzzle box of references, a secret history of an entire era, a song that everyone knows but few truly understand. Don McLean himself has famously remained cryptic, preferring to let the song speak for itself, saying, "It means I'll never have to work again." But the song is far more than that. It is a detailed, passionate, and ultimately tragic eulogy for the birth, life, and violent death of the rock and roll dream. It is Don McLean's personal testimony, a musical map that charts the fall of American innocence, from the pure, simple promise of the 1950s to the cynical, fractured, and dark reality of the 1960s end. This is not just a song about music. It's a song about the day the music died. This is the story of American Pie. To understand the tragedy, we must first understand the Eden that was lost. A long, long time ago, I can still remember how that music used to make me smile. Don McLean, born in 1945, was a child of the 1950s. He was part of the first generation of teenagers who had not lived through the Great Depression or been sent to fight in a world war. His parents' generation, the one that had survived those global traumas, had built a new, prosperous, and profoundly conformist America. It was the era of the suburbs, the gray flannel suit, the television set, and the baby boom. Life was supposed to be orderly, predictable. Authority figures, parents, teachers, politicians, were meant to be respected without question. This was the America projected in sitcoms like Leave It to Beaver or Father Knows Best. Stable, prosperous, overwhelmingly white, and deeply conservative in its social mores. Yet, beneath this placid surface, anxieties simmered. The omnipresent fear of nuclear annihilation in the Cold War, the growing tremors of the civil rights movement challenging centuries of racial injustice, and a quiet sense of unease among the young about the sterile perfection they were expected to inherit. The music of this adult world reflected this stability. It was safe, comfortable, and predictable. It was the sound of Perry Como, of Patti Page singing "How Much Is That Doggy in the Window?" of the soaring, string-laden orchestras of Mantovani. It was music as wallpaper, polite and polished, designed not to offend or excite, but to soothe. Into this placid, orderly world, rock and roll exploded like a cultural atom bomb. It was a sound that, for the first time, belonged entirely to the young. It was a fusion of rhythm and blues, what was then called race music, often relegated to specific radio stations and record stores, and country and western or hillbilly music. By its very nature, it was a sound that crossed forbidden lines. It was loud, it was visceral, and to the adult world, it was dangerous. It was denounced from pulpits as the devil's music, and by segregationists as a plot to corrupt white youth. DJs like Alan Freed championed the sound, bringing it to a mass audience, but also faced persecution and accusations in the payola scandals, which seemed aimed at silencing this rebellious new noise. Rock and roll wasn't just a new genre. It was a social phenomenon, a crack in the conformist facade. It was driven by a backbeat, a simple, primal rhythm that was impossible not to move to. It was about cars, high school, first love, and a feeling of freedom that was intoxicating. For a young Don McLean, this music wasn't just entertainment. It was a lifeline. He was a boy in New Rochelle, New York, who suffered from severe asthma. He was often sick, isolated, and spent long periods out of school. He would later say, "I wasn't a very happy kid." This isolation made his connection to the outside world more intense, more focused. This new music, crackling out of a small transistor radio, itself a symbol of youthful independence, was his companion. It was his connection to a vibrant, energetic world that seemed a million miles away from his sickbed. It was a secret language, a promise of a bigger life. This music was his sacred store. It was a source of pure, unadulterated joy. And in the pantheon of these new gods, one figure stood out to him, not for his danger or his swagger, but for his authenticity: Buddy Holly. Buddy Holly was not a pre-packaged idol. He was a lanky, bespectacled kid from Lubbock, Texas. He looked like the boy who delivered your newspaper, not a matinee idol. He was, in many ways, the unlikeliest of rock stars. He wasn't conventionally handsome like Elvis. He didn't have the wild, flamboyant persona of Little Richard. But he had something that, for McLean, was even more important. He was a complete artist. He wrote his own songs, often simple, direct tales of teenage romance like Peggy Sue, or declarations of devotion like True Love Ways. He led his own band, the Crickets, establishing the two-guitar, bass, and drums lineup that the Beatles themselves would later copy. Their very name, the Beatles, was a direct insect-inspired homage to the Crickets. He was an innovator, experimenting with multi-track recording and new song structures, long before such studio wizardry was common. He was one of the first to use the Fender Stratocaster as a lead instrument, giving rock a new, bright, trebly voice, distinct from the jazzier tones of earlier electric guitars. He was a studio scientist, using techniques like the paradiddle drum beat on Peggy Sue, played by Jerry Allison on a cardboard box, or the gentle Celesta on Every Day. He even experimented with orchestral arrangements on songs like True Love Ways, pointing the way forward for the pop music of the next decade. But he was also relatable. He sang about love, loss, and youthful longing with a sincere, hiccuping vocal style that was all his own, a signature sound instantly recognizable. He was the everyman as rock star, the boy next door who was also a genius. He represented the American pie itself, wholesome, optimistic, and fundamentally good. McLean was a 13-year-old paperboy on the morning of February 3, 1959. This is the song's inciting incident, the personal trauma from which the entire narrative flows. February made me shiver. With every paper I'd deliver, bad news on the doorstep. I couldn't take one more step. That morning, the headline on the papers he delivered read like a death notice for the era. A small plane, a 4-seater Beechcraft Bonanza, had crashed in a frozen cornfield outside Clear Lake, Iowa. The tour was called the Winter Dance Party, a grueling, poorly planned bus tour through the frozen Midwest in the dead of winter. The distances between gigs were enormous, the schedule relentless. The musicians were traveling in a repurposed school bus with a broken heater. The drummer, Carl Bunch, had been hospitalized with frost-bitten feet. The musicians were burning newspapers in the aisles to stay warm. Buddy Holly, tired of the miserable conditions, had chartered the small plane to fly to the next stop, Fargo, North Dakota, after their show at the surf ballroom. He wanted to get some sleep and simply do his laundry. His bandmates, Waylon Jennings and Tommy Alsop, gave up their seats. Jennings gave his seat to J.P. the Big Bopper Richardson, who had the flu and was complaining about the cold. Alsop lost his seat to 17-year-old Richie Valens, the La Bamba phenom, on a coin toss. This coin toss is a moment of pure, tragic chance, a tiny fulcrum on which rock history pivoted. The pilot, young and inexperienced in those icy, snowy conditions, took off into a blizzard and lost control within minutes. On board were three of rock and roll's brightest stars: Richie Valens, J.P. the Big Bopper, Richardson, and the man who was the very soul of the music for McLean, Buddy Holly. For the 13-year-old boy, this was not a distant celebrity tragedy. It was a personal loss. He would later say, "That was the day the music died." This phrase, which he would coin more than a decade later, became the song's central thesis. It was the moment the music's pure, joyous spirit was extinguished. It was the fall from the Garden of Eden. The other gods of 1950s rock had fallen in more worldly ways. Elvis was drafted into the army in 1958, a symbolic neutering of the rebel shipped off to Germany, away from his audience. Chuck Berry was in jail for violating the Mann Act, a victim of his own demons and a racist legal system. Jerry Lee Lewis was disgraced by scandal for marrying his 13-year-old cousin, becoming a pariah, blacklisted from radio. But Holly's death was different. It was pure, random, and absolute. It was a tragedy without a moral. In the immediate aftermath, the music industry, sensing danger and opportunity, rushed to fill the void. They pushed a wave of safe, parent-approved teen idols from Philadelphia, like Frankie Avalon, Fabian, and Bobby Rydell. These were handsome boys who didn't write their own songs and didn't play their own instruments. They were products, not artists. For McLean, the authentic music was gone, replaced by hollow facsimiles. The song's happy, rolling chorus, "Bye Bye Miss American Pie," is not a celebration. It is a farewell. It is the sound of that 13-year-old boy waving goodbye to the purity he once knew. Miss American Pie is that lost 1950s innocence, the wholesome ideal that was shattered. The song's narrative then moves forward, out of the frozen cornfield and into the 1960s, an era defined by the vacuum that Holly and the other pioneers left behind. The music's innocence is gone, and new, more complicated figures are rising to take its place. Did you write the book of love? And do you have faith in God above, if the Bible tells you so? This is a direct nod to the Monotones' 1958 hit, The Book of Love, a perfect example of the simple, doo-wop innocence that was lost. The lyrics are almost comically simple. I wonder, who wrote the Book of Love? It's a question from a simpler time, a time when the Bible and a pop song could be mentioned in the same breath without irony. It's a world where love is a simple written code, not the complex, dangerous, and sexually charged, free love that would come to define the 1960s. McLean is asking the music itself, and the girl he's dancing with, if they still believe in these simple truths. But the 1960s are not interested in simple faith. A new king has been crowned, and a new fool has entered the court. Well, I know that you're in love with him, 'cause I saw you dancin' in the gym. You both kicked off your shoes. Man, I dig those rhythm and blues. This is a memory of the 1950s, the high school sock hop, the last moment of shared, simple joy. This is the world Buddy Holly made. It was music for dancing, for community. But that joy is fleeting. The song's narrator is now older, and he sees the world changing. I was a lonely teenage Bronco buck with a pink carnation and a pickup truck. But I knew I was out of luck the day the music died. The 1950s greaser, the character from a Buddy Holly song, is now obsolete. His world of pink carnations, a nod to the 1957 Marty Robbins song, A White Sport Coat and a Pink Carnation, and pickup trucks, is a relic. His time is over. The optimism he represented is no longer fashionable. Now the song introduces its new royalty. Now the king, he was singin' in the thorny crown. This is almost universally understood to be Elvis Presley. Elvis was the undisputed king of 1950s rock and roll, a figure of raw, revolutionary power. He was the one who terrified parents, who brought a dangerous, sexual energy to the music, straight from the Sun Records studio in Memphis, famously captured in the Ed Sullivan Show appearance, where he was filmed only from the waist up. But by the early 1960s, the king had changed. After returning from the Army in 1960, he was pushed by his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, into a decade of bland, profitable Hollywood movies. The rebel who had stunned the world with Heartbreak Hotel and Jailhouse Rock was now singing Bossa Nova Baby in Fun in Acapulco, or Do the Clam in Clambake. The thorny crown is a brilliant twofold metaphor. It's the burden of a fame that trapped him in a golden cage in Hollywood, forcing him to make trivial art, disconnected from the pulse of the changing times. And it's a crown of thorns, a biblical allusion to a Messiah, or in this case, a false Messiah. He was a king who had lost his kingdom and his divine purpose. He had abdicated his throne, choosing safety and wealth over the raw, revolutionary power he once wielded. He was still the king in name, but the title was hollow. Even his brief return to relevance in the '68 comeback special was a fleeting moment before settling into the sequined spectacle of his Las Vegas years, a parody of his former self. With the true king having abdicated his throne, a new, more enigmatic figure arrives. While the Jester sang for the king and queen in a coat he borrowed from James Dean. This is Bob Dylan. Dylan was the ultimate jester, the trickster, the poet who spoke truth to power. He was the antithesis of 50s rock. He brought dense literary lyrics, political consciousness, and a voice that was anything but nice. He didn't sing, he preached. The Jester is a classic figure in the royal court, the only one allowed to tell the king the truth, often in riddles. This was Dylan's exact relationship with the press and his audience, playful, antagonistic, and deeply intelligent. The coat he borrowed from James Dean refers to the iconic windbreaker Dylan wore on the cover of the Freewheelin' Bob Dylan, a direct visual link to the 1950s rebel archetype, but a different kind of rebel, the intellectual, the beatnik, and a voice that came from you and me. Dylan, in his early folk phase, was the voice of the people, the voice of the new generation. He sang of blowin' in the wind, masters of war, and the times they are a-changin'. He sang directly about the injustices of the time, the civil rights struggle, the threat of nuclear war. He sang for the king and queen, which could be a reference to the folk royalty, Pete Seeger and Joan Baez, or perhaps even a nod to President Kennedy and Jackie, the royalty of Camelot, whom the folk scene had championed. He literally performed at the March on Washington in 1963. But this Jester, too, would prove fleeting. Oh, and while the king was looking down, the Jester stole his thorny crown. Dylan did the unthinkable in 1965. He stole the crown of rock and roll by going electric at the Newport Folk Festival. This was a seismic event. The folk purists, the king and queen, were horrified. They booed him. Pete Seeger allegedly tried to cut the power with an axe. Dylan had taken their folk music and plugged it into the wall. He had combined the lyrical depth of the Jester with the sonic power of the king. He wasn't just stealing Elvis's crown of rock. He was stealing the thorny crown of relevance, all while the king, Elvis, was looking down from his Hollywood perch, completely missing the revolution. The royal court, however, was in chaos. The courtroom was adjourned / no verdict was returned. The old rules were dead. Was this new electric sound folk or rock? No one knew what rock and roll was supposed to be anymore. The lines were blurring. And just as Dylan reached his creative peak, releasing Blonde on Blonde in 1966, he too vanished. And while Lennon read a book on Marx, the quartet practiced in the park, and we sang dirges in the dark, the day the music died. Here the Beatles enter the narrative, the quartet. While John Lennon is becoming radicalized, a book on Marx, a nod to his growing political consciousness, and controversial statements like being more popular than Jesus, the band is practicing, moving from a simple rock band, I Want to Hold Your Hand, into something far more complex and experimental. They are practicing in the park, Candlestick Park in San Francisco, the site of their final live concert in 1966, after which they retreated into the studio. This line also sets up the dirges in the dark, a reference to the post-Kennedy, post-Camelot malaise, the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy that would soon follow in 1968. The optimism is fading. The Jester himself disappears. And the Jester on the sidelines in a cast. This is a direct reference to Bob Dylan's mysterious motorcycle accident in July 1966. After the crash, Dylan retreated from public view for years, becoming an enigmatic recluse in Woodstock, New York. He entered his basement tapes era, making music in private, no longer a public prophet. The voice of the generation had, for a time, gone silent. The revolution was left without its chief poet. The song's narrative now spirals into the heart of the 1960s counterculture, and for McLean, this is where the dream truly curdles. Helter-skelter in a summer swelter. This line is one of the darkest. Helter-skelter is a chaotic, noisy, proto-metal song from the Beatles' 1968 White Album. It was Paul McCartney's attempt to create the loudest, most raucous song possible. But in the summer of 1969, Charles Manson, a failed musician and cult leader, co-opted the song's title as a name for his apocalyptic race war. He believed the Beatles were speaking to him directly through the White Album, sending him coded messages to begin his murderous spree. The horrific Tate LaBianca murders, which shocked the world, were carried out under this banner. McLean is making a terrifying point. The music of Love, the Beatles, had somehow, perversely, become the soundtrack for murder. The summer swelter is the heat of August 1969, the month of the Manson murders. The White Album itself was a symbol of the Beatles' fragmentation, a collection of solo songs, a stark contrast to their unified past. The birds flew off for fallout shelter, 8 miles high and falling fast. The Byrds, another foundational 60s band who had essentially co-invented folk rock by electrifying Dylan's songs, Mr. Tambourine Man, are referenced. 8 Miles High was their 1966 psychedelic hit, a song widely banned on radio for its drug references. It was the sound of the new psychedelic optimism, the idea of expanding your consciousness. But by 1969, the band, like so many others, was fracturing. Graham Parsons had joined and left, pulling them toward country music. They were falling fast from their commercial and cultural peak. The music is falling fast, crashing from the high of drug-fueled optimism into the harsh reality of drug abuse and burnout. The scene is set for the 1960s grand, tragic finale. It landed foul on the grass. The players tried to take the field. The marching band refused to yield. This is one of the song's most debated verses. It's a complex metaphor for the shift in music. The players are the original rock and rollers, the Buddy Holly-era bands, the ones who played for dancing, for joy. The marching band is the Beatles, specifically in their Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band era. Sgt. Pepper's, released in 1967, was the album that changed everything. It was a concept album, a work of art. It was the unofficial soundtrack to the Summer of Love. But for McLean, a folk purist at heart, this was a negative. It was music that couldn't be played live. It was self-indulgent. It was perfume, not sweat. We all got up to dance. Oh, but we never got the chance, 'cause the players tried to take the field. The marching band refused to yield. The audience, the original fans, were left behind. The music had become self-important, a sweet perfume, the smell of marijuana, the hippie movement that clouded the air. The marching band of art rock had taken over, and the simple, visceral joy of 1950s rock was now a distant memory. The Beatles themselves had stopped touring in 1966, retreating into the studio, becoming a marching band that would no longer play for a live audience. But the final, fatal blow had not yet landed. The song's climax, its darkest circle of hell, is reserved for the Rolling Stones. So come on, Jack be nimble, Jack be quick / Jack Flash sat on a candlestick. Jack Flash is, of course, Mick Jagger, the lead singer of the Rolling Stones, who released Jumpin' Jack Flash in 1968. The candlestick is the stage, and Jagger is the performer, the new high priest of this dark ceremony. The fire is the only friend. This is a nod to the Stones' song, Play with Fire. The music is no longer about love. It's about danger, chaos, and destruction. The Stones were the anti-Beatles, the dark shadow of the 60s, and McLean is now putting them at the center of the story. This entire verse is a direct, visceral account of the Altamont Speedway Free Festival on December 6, 1969. This event was meant to be the glorious, celebratory conclusion to the decade. Just 4 months earlier, Woodstock had proven that 500,000 young people could gather in peace, a seeming triumph of the counterculture. The Rolling Stones wanted to create their own Woodstock West to cap off their American tour. It became its funeral. They made the fatal decision to hire the Hells Angels motorcycle gang as security, paying them in beer. The event was a disaster from the start. It was badly organized. The location was a desolate speedway, not a pastoral farm. A palpable air of menace hung over the crowd, fueled by bad acid and the open brutality of the Hells Angels, who were beating people with pool cues from the very beginning. This is the Satan that McLean describes. As I watched him on the stage, my hands were clenched in fists of rage. No angel born in hell could break that Satan's spell. McLean is painting a picture of Mick Jagger, preening on stage, dressed in an Omega symbol shirt, singing Sympathy for the Devil and Under My Thumb as the crowd grew more and more violent. The angel born in hell is a Hell's Angel. and the spell was broken in the most horrific way possible. The violence had been escalating all day. Marty Balin of Jefferson Airplane was knocked unconscious by an angel. A Hells Angels motorcycle was knocked over near the stage, and the gang began beating the crowd. The Grateful Dead, scheduled to play, took one look at the scene and refused, leaving by helicopter. During the Stones' set, a young black man in the crowd named Meredith Hunter, allegedly high on methamphetamines, pulled out a .22 caliber revolver. A Hells Angel named Alan Pissarro saw him, rushed forward, and stabbed him to death, right in front of the stage. This was all captured on film for the Gimme Shelter documentary, a dark mirror to the peace and love imagery of Woodstock. The band played on, seemingly unaware of the murder just feet away from them. For McLean, this was the end. This was the moment the 60s dream of peace and love didn't just fade away. It was brutally murdered by its own dark, violent underbelly. The 1950s died in a plane crash, an act of God. The 1960s died at Altamont, an act of man, a sacrifice to Satan. The music was well and truly dead. The song's final verses are an epilogue, a walk through the ruins. I met a girl who sang the blues, and I asked her for some happy news, but she just smiled and turned away. This is almost certainly Janis Joplin, the great blues singer of the era, a woman who, like Buddy Holly, represented a pure, authentic musical spirit. She sang with raw, unfiltered emotion, but she too was a victim of the era's destructive excess, dying of a drug overdose in October 1970, just a few weeks after Jimi Hendrix. The happy news line is a bitter joke. The blues, the very root of rock and roll, has no happy news to offer. The music itself is exhausted and broken. Her smile is not one of joy, but of sad, weary resignation. I went down to the Sacred Store, where I'd heard the music years before, but the man there said the music wouldn't play. This is the song's most heartbreaking verse. The narrator, now an adult in the early 1970s, returns to the Sacred Store, the record shop, the radio, the very source of his youthful joy. He is looking for that original 1950s music, the simple, honest sound of Buddy Holly. But the man, the record executive, the radio DJ, the tastemaker, tells him that simple, pure music wouldn't play anymore. It's not commercial. It's not what the cynical, fragmented 1970s audience wants to hear. The world has moved on, embracing the corporate rock of bands like Grand Funk Railroad, the intellectual bombast of prog rock like Yes or Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and the artifice of glam rock. The me decade had begun, and the sensitive singer-songwriter, a category McLean himself, ironically, would be placed in, was in vogue. The community of rock and roll, the shared experience of the sock hop, was gone, replaced by individual, fragmented audiences. The narrator is left with nothing. The church of rock and roll is empty, and so he delivers his final judgment, the song's closing statement on the entire saga. And the three men I admire most, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. They caught the last train for the coast, the day the music died. This is the great, final mystery. This is not the Christian Trinity. This is Don McLean's personal Trinity, the Holy Ghost of the music that inspired him. The Father, Buddy Holly, the originator, the creator of the sound, the man who wrote, played, and sang his own truth. The Son, Richie Valens, the 17-year-old inheritor of the new sound, the future, the next generation, a symbol of the music's Latino influences. The Holy Ghost, J.P. the Big Bopper. Richardson, the spirit of pure rock and roll joy, a man known for his larger-than-life personality and his novelty hit Chantilly Lace. They represent the three faces of the 50s dream: artistry, youth, and fun. And they are gone. They caught the last train for the coast, an old-fashioned phrase for disappearing, for leaving the cold, dead center of the country behind. It's an American archetype. Go west. But here, it's a final act, an abandonment. It can also be seen as a reference to the music industry's shift from New York, Tin Pan Alley, Folk Village, to Los Angeles, Laurel Canyon, movie studios, corporate rock. The coast is where the business went, leaving the authentic, gritty East Coast folk scene, McLean's home, behind. The gods have left the building. The song ends as it began, with the chorus. But now, after this 8-minute journey, the words are infinitely heavier. We were singing Bye-Bye Miss American Pie. It is a final, mournful farewell. Why does this song endure? It's not just a Where's Waldo of rock and roll references. It's not a puzzle to be solved. American Pie has lasted for over half a century because it is a perfect vessel for our own sense of loss. It is a secular hymn for nostalgia itself. Don McLean captured a universal human experience. The feeling that the world we grew up in was purer, simpler, and more magical than the one we inhabit now. He wrote a song about the death of his innocence, the music of his youth. But in doing so, he created an anthem that allows every generation to mourn its own lost Eden, its own day the music died. Whether it's the grunge movement giving way to boy bands, or the indie rock scene being consumed by corporate festivals, every listener has their own moment when the music changed, when something pure seemed to be lost. He didn't just write a history of rock and roll. He wrote the story of growing up and realizing the world is more complicated, more tragic, and more broken than you ever imagined. And that is why, 50 years later, we are still singing, still listening, and still trying to decode the meaning of American Pie.